When my husband casually mentioned that his son would be staying with us for a week, I smiled and nodded as if it didn't matter. But it did. Not because of who he was, but because of who I had become. The version of me that used to be excited about guests or change had long disappeared into the folds of routine. I stirred my tea, pretending to listen to the details of his flight and arrival, but all I could think about was the silence in our home, and how loud it might become with someone else in it. I didn't expect anything unusual. I didn't expect anything at all. That's the point. I had stopped expecting. Yet, when he stepped through our door with his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, the air changed. I felt it. It wasn't his scent or his eyes or the way his voice dropped lower than I remembered. It was the way I noticed. And that terrified me. Not because I thought it meant something, but because I couldn't explain why I noticed it all. He wasn't a stranger. But he wasn't a boy anymore either. And over the next few days, in between the clinking of dishes and polite conversation, I found myself wondering something I had no business wondering. Until the night it all cracked. And now, if you're listening to this story, tell me in the comments, have you ever had a thought you knew you shouldn't? A feeling you were afraid to name? Because that's where it started for me. And if you're still here, I'll tell you everything. How I got there. What I saw. What I felt. What I did. I remember the sound of the kettle whistling that morning more vividly than anything else. It was sharp, relentless, like a warning I didn't yet understand. I turned off the stove and poured hot water into the cups without looking at my husband. We had developed a rhythm over the years, polite, coordinated, almost mechanical. Sugar for him, no sugar for me. He folded the newspaper before taking a sip, commenting on something I didn't care enough to register. When he told me his son would be visiting, I nodded. I said, of course, and smiled with the edge of my mouth, as I always did. But inside, I felt a tension I couldn't name. I didn't dislike his son. I barely knew him. He was part of his past, and I had never been a part of that chapter. But the idea of someone new disrupting the quiet stillness we had built, or fallen into, made my chest tighten. The guest room hadn't been used in months. I'd changed the sheets, aired out the pillows, and arranged the towels like I was preparing for a stranger. In a way, I was. The last time I had seen him, he was still in college. Tall and polite, but distant. I didn't expect much to change. But when he arrived, I saw it immediately, in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me. Not as a child looks at someone older, but as a man looks at someone he doesn't quite know yet. I didn't understand why that made my hands shake slightly as I poured him a glass of water. We sat in the living room that evening, the three of us, catching up over dinner. My husband did most of the talking. He always did. His son, I'll call him that, even though he never felt like mine, listened politely, answered briefly. I watched them from across the table, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. The space between father and son was filled with polite distance. And I felt something strange in that distance. A reflection, maybe, of the space between me and the man I had married. Later that night, I walked past the guest room and paused when I saw the light still on. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear soft music playing, something instrumental, slow, melancholic. I stood there for a moment, not moving, just listening. I wasn't spying. At least that's what I told myself. I was just curious. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized I wasn't listening to the music. I was listening to the feeling inside me. A subtle ache. Not desire. Not yet. Just the feeling of being awake. The next few days blurred into each other. We exchanged glances during breakfast. Not intentional. Not inappropriate. but charged, in a way I couldn't deny. He would offer to help me with the dishes, and our hands would brush briefly. He would hold the door open for me, and I would feel a flicker in my chest that I tried to smother with guilt. And all the while, my husband remained oblivious. He spoke about work. About news. About things that didn't matter. He kissed me on the cheek when he left in the morning and said, "See you later," like always. Like everything was fine. But it wasn't. Not because something had happened, nothing had. But because I had started feeling something. A shift. A pull. And once you feel that, it's hard to go back to pretending. One afternoon, while my husband was out running errands, I found myself in the kitchen making tea. He, the son, walked in, barefoot, carrying a book. He smiled, softly, as if he didn't want to disturb me. I smiled back. He sat at the table, flipping through pages, and I poured him a cup without asking. "Thanks," he said. It was the first time we were truly alone. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise from his cup. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was intimate. Not in a way I could explain, but in a way I felt in my skin. He looked up. "It's quiet here," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It usually is." He nodded. "I like it." I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. And yet, everything in that silence felt louder than words. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his steady breathing like a metronome, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what it was that I was truly feeling. Was it attention? Was it temptation? Was it just the thrill of being seen? I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would quiet my thoughts. But it didn't. If anything, it made them louder. The next morning, I dressed with more care than usual. A blouse I hadn't worn in months. A touch of lipstick I had almost forgotten I owned. I didn't do it for him. I told myself that. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw the way his eyes lingered for just a second too long, I felt it. That pull again. And deep inside, I knew something had already shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. The morning after felt no different on the surface. The kettle boiled as always, the floorboards creaked in the same rhythm under my feet, and the sun filtered through the curtains in its usual lazy angles. But inside me, something had rearranged itself. I moved slower, more carefully, as if each step might shatter the illusion that everything was still ordinary. My husband sat at the table reading the news on his tablet, grumbling about the stock market. I stirred my tea in silence, pretending to listen. The air shifted slightly when he entered the room. Not with sound or smell, but with presence. That quiet, composed posture of his, the way he always gave a small nod before speaking, it unsettled me now. I hated how much I noticed these things. I hated how my skin became aware of his nearness in a way it hadn't for anyone in years. We exchanged polite words over breakfast. He complimented the eggs. I said thank you. My husband didn't notice anything odd, but I felt every glance like a spotlight. Every pause between words like a secret. I told myself I was being foolish. That this tension was only in my head. But the warmth that crept up my neck whenever he looked at me said otherwise. That afternoon, my husband left for a few hours to meet a client. I busied myself with laundry, folding towels, watering plants, anything to stay distracted. But the house had grown too quiet. Every sound echoed. When I passed the hallway, I noticed his door slightly ajar. He was inside, headphones on, sketching something in a notebook. I didn't mean to look. But I did. Just for a second. He caught me. I hesitated, unsure whether to apologize or pretend I hadn't been watching. But then he smiled, not teasingly, not arrogantly, just kindly. A small, understanding smile. I turned and walked away, but my heart was racing in a way that made folding laundry suddenly feel impossible. In the evening, my husband suggested a movie. We all sat in the living room, a bowl of popcorn between us, the television casting soft blue light across our faces. He sat on one end of the couch, my husband on the other, and I found myself in the middle, arms crossed, legs tucked under me. The movie played, but I couldn't follow it. My thoughts kept drifting. I could feel the warmth of his leg near mine, not touching, but close enough. I shifted slightly, creating space, then moments later, shifted back. My husband dozed off halfway through the film. He often did. I lowered the volume and glanced at him, gently snoring. I looked the other way and met his eyes. He wasn't watching the movie either. He was watching me. Neither of us spoke. The silence was too delicate, like a tightrope stretched across a canyon. One wrong word, one wrong breath, and everything could collapse. And yet, the silence became louder than words. Eventually, I stood up and collected the empty glasses. He followed me into the kitchen, offering to help. I shook my head. "It's fine," I whispered, even though there was no need to whisper. Still, I kept my voice low. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe out of fear that speaking too loudly would make everything too real. He didn't insist. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me as I rinsed dishes. I felt the weight of his gaze, the awareness of my movements. I hated that I enjoyed it. I hated that I noticed. When I turned off the tap and reached for the towel, he was still there. Still quiet. Still looking. I dried my hands slowly, suddenly conscious of how exposed they felt. "I should head to bed," I said softly. He nodded, then hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." I looked up, surprised. "You didn't." And that was the truth. He hadn't. I had done that to myself. He gave a small nod again. That same quiet nod that somehow made everything worse. Or better. I couldn't tell. I stepped past him, and our arms brushed. Just barely. But that single moment sent a shiver through me so sharp it left a trail. In my bedroom, I lay awake beside my husband, staring at the ceiling again. But this time, it wasn't questions that kept me up, it was answers I didn't want to face. The realization that I had crossed a line, even if no one else could see it. The understanding that this wasn't about infidelity. It was about awakening. About remembering what it meant to be desired. To feel visible. The next morning, I woke early. I wanted time alone. I needed to find myself before the day got loud again. I walked out into the garden barefoot, letting the damp grass cool the heat in my chest. The roses needed trimming. The herbs had overgrown. I busied myself with pruning and cutting, pretending it mattered. He joined me unexpectedly. Quiet footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. "Need help?" he asked. I nodded, handing him the small basket. We worked in silence for several minutes, moving around each other naturally, as if we had done this for years. It felt familiar in a way it shouldn't have. At one point, he reached over my shoulder to clip a branch I couldn't reach. His arm brushed my back, light and brief. I closed my eyes for a second, steadying my breath. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. I turned slightly. "What do you mean?" "In life. Like you're watching it happen instead of living it." I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. My silence said enough. He nodded again, as if he understood something I hadn't said. Later that day, my husband suggested we all go away for a weekend. "To the mountains," he said. It's been too long since we took a break. I nodded again. I always did. But this time, my thoughts weren't on the trip. They were on the space we were already in. The kind you don't escape by changing scenery. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with a book I didn't read. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I listened to the ticking of the clock and realized I wasn't waiting for sleep. I was waiting for the feeling to pass. But it didn't. The days leading up to the trip passed in a haze of routines and overthinking. I moved through each moment carefully, like walking barefoot across broken glass. Every gesture, every glance, every word I spoke, I weighed it before releasing it into the air, afraid it might reveal too much. My husband remained cheerfully oblivious, making plans for the mountain getaway as if it were a long-awaited honeymoon. He joked about fresh air and unplugging from everything. I smiled when I was supposed to and nodded in all the right places, but inside, something had begun to fracture. I busied myself with packing, making lists, checking weather forecasts. Folding sweaters and pairing socks felt oddly soothing. Tangible tasks. Predictable. Safe. The kind of things that didn't unravel your sense of self. I avoided being alone in the same room with him, though not in any obvious way. I moved a little faster when he walked in, lingered a little longer in the garden, volunteered to run errands I normally found tedious. But I knew he noticed, even if he didn't say anything. There was a different kind of silence now, not just shared, but charged. On the morning of the trip, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running my fingers through my hair. I didn't apply makeup, but I did put on earrings, small silver ones I hadn't worn in months. I told myself it was habit, that I wanted to feel put together. But as I stepped out and saw the way his eyes paused briefly when I entered the room, I felt the truth settle into my stomach like a stone. The drive to the mountains was long and winding. My husband did most of the talking, narrating stories from past road trips, commenting on roadside diners and forgotten landmarks. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur past the window, my mind elsewhere. He sat in the back, headphones in, head leaned against the window. Occasionally, our eyes met in the rearview mirror. No words. Just flashes of something unspoken. The cabin was small but charming, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a porch that overlooked the valley below. Inside, the space was intimate, almost too much so. One bedroom with a queen-sized bed, a fold-out couch in the living area, and barely enough space between furniture to pretend there were boundaries. I noticed the mistake immediately, but my husband laughed it off. They must have misread the booking. It's fine. We'll manage, he said, setting his bag down near the couch. I nodded. What else could I do? That first evening, we cooked a simple meal, pasta, salad, wine. The atmosphere was light. My husband played music from his phone while we ate by candlelight, as the overhead bulb flickered unpredictably. He raised a toast to fresh air and new beginnings, and I clinked my glass to his without much conviction. After dinner, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the night air crisp and fragrant with pine. The stars were clearer than I remembered, sharp and endless. My husband talked about childhood trips, memories I had heard before but smiled at anyway. Eventually, he excused himself to shower, leaving the two of us alone. I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. He leaned back in the wooden chair beside me, gazing up at the sky. It's quiet, he said finally. It is, I replied. He nodded slightly, then looked at me. You seem quieter than usual. I hesitated before responding. Maybe I've just gotten used to the silence. That answer lingered longer than it should have. I felt him watching me for a moment before he looked away. Nothing else was said. That night, the cabin creaked inside as the temperature dropped. I lay beside my husband in the bedroom, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. He had fallen asleep quickly, his breath deep and even. I stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between gusts. Sleep felt impossible. At some point in the early hours, I rose to get water. I moved through the cabin as quietly as I could, but the floorboards betrayed me with each step. As I reached the kitchen, I noticed a light glow from the living area. He was awake, sitting on the couch, a blanket over his legs, reading something by flashlight. He looked up when he saw me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No. The wind is loud." He nodded and gestured toward the chair across from him. "Want to sit for a bit?" I hesitated, then walked over and lowered myself into the chair, pulling my cardigan tight around me. The silence between us was different here, not awkward, not forced. It felt like we were both aware of how fragile this moment was. We didn't speak much. Just sat, listening to the wind, the ticking of the old wall clock, the occasional crack of the wooden frame adjusting to the cold. After a while, I stood to return to bed. "Good night," I said. He looked up, his eyes steady. "Good night." Back in bed, my husband shifted in his sleep, rolling toward me. His arm draped across my waist out of habit. I lay still, feeling the weight of it, not comforted but confined. I closed my eyes and tried to recall what it felt like when that touch made me feel safe. I couldn't remember. The next morning, I woke before the others. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the mist curl through the trees like breath from the earth. The quiet was thicker today. Denser. I found it harder to move through. When he joined me in the kitchen, I barely looked at him. But I felt everything. The way his hand brushed the counter as he passed. The way he said thank you when I poured him coffee, his voice lower than usual. The way he stood just a little too close when we washed dishes side by side. Later, we hiked a short trail behind the cabin. My husband led the way, eager and talkative. I trailed behind, and so did he. At one point, we paused at a clearing that overlooked the valley. My husband walked further ahead to take photos. We stood in silence, just the two of us. "You look different here," he said. "How so?" "I don't know." "Lighter." I didn't answer. I couldn't. We continued walking. That evening, back at the cabin, the light flickered again, then went out completely. My husband grumbled and lit candles, muttering about the fuse box. We played a board game by candlelight and laughed at the absurdity of it all. For a moment, it felt normal. But it wasn't. Because nothing was normal anymore. The following day greeted us with a heavy, gray sky. The kind of weather that presses gently against your chest, reminding you of everything unspoken. It wasn't raining yet, but the scent of moisture hung in the air, earthy and thick. I stood by the window holding a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching clouds stretch themselves like bruises over the mountaintops. My husband bustled around the kitchen behind me, humming an old tune under his breath as he prepared breakfast. He had always been an early riser, and in the quiet moments of morning, he seemed his most content. He asked if I wanted eggs or toast, and I answered without really hearing myself speak. He poured coffee into his thermos and started making plans for the day, a trail he wanted us to try, a picnic by the lake, maybe a detour to see the old stone church on the far side of the woods. I smiled where appropriate, nodded at intervals, but my mind wasn't following the details. It was anchored to something else. He walked in a few minutes later, rubbing his hands together from the chill. He greeted us both and thanked my husband for the breakfast. I didn't meet his eyes. I couldn't. The table was quiet except for the scraping of forks and the occasional comment from my husband. The silence between the two of us had grown denser, not uncomfortable, but electric. like a wire strung too tightly between us. Each word felt dangerous. Every glance was a risk. We spent the morning walking along a narrow trail lined with pine and aspen. The leaves above trembled with the faintest breeze. My husband led the way, moving briskly ahead, pointing out different plants and commenting on trail markers. I lagged behind, not from fatigue but from a desire to move at my own pace. He fell in step beside me, a comfortable silence growing between our footsteps. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, but I could feel the rhythm of his breathing beside me. At one point, his arm brushed mine slightly, just enough to make me catch my breath. It could have been an accident. Probably was. But the effect was disproportionate. My skin burned with awareness, and I found myself focusing harder on where I placed my steps, as though balance had suddenly become more complicated. When we reached the overlook, a small rocky ledge that opened into a valley of trees below, we paused. My husband moved to the edge, taking photos with his phone, then wandered off a bit to find a better angle. The two of us remained behind, standing a few feet apart in silence. He spoke first. "You've been quiet," he said, not accusingly, just noticing. "I suppose I've been thinking," I answered. He nodded and didn't press. That, somehow, made it worse. I turned to look at the valley below, the sweep of green and gray disappearing into mist. It was beautiful. Majestic, even. But all I could feel was the tightening in my chest, the pressure of being between two worlds I didn't know how to navigate. When we returned to the cabin, the atmosphere felt heavier. The air inside was warmer than outside, but it offered no comfort. I busied myself with tidying the common area, folding blankets, refilling the water filter, wiping the kitchen counter that didn't really need wiping. Anything to avoid eye contact. Anything to feel like I still had control. Later, as my husband took a nap in the bedroom, I stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up, tossing leaves in spirals across the wooden floorboards. I leaned against the railing, watching the trees sway, my fingers curled around the railing so tightly that my knuckles ached. The sound of the door opening behind me made me freeze. He stepped out quietly, standing beside me without saying a word. We both stared into the trees. There was a moment, not long, but long enough, where I could feel every inch of the space between us. "I should probably go back inside," I said softly, not looking at him. "You don't have to," he replied. I said nothing. But I didn't move either. We stayed like that for a few minutes. Still. Alert. I could hear his breathing, slightly uneven. And I wondered if he could hear mine. That evening, we cooked again, all three of us moving in the kitchen in a sort of delicate dance. The mood was lighter than it had been all day. My husband made a joke about how we should rent cabins more often. "Something about the altitude makes you forget why you were stressed," he said, laughing. I smiled, because it was expected. I served the salad. I passed the bread. I laughed at the right moment. But my insides felt twisted in knots. After dinner, he suggested a card game, and we played for over an hour, the three of us seated around the table with candles flickering nearby. The game offered distraction, a return to something normal, something childlike. I almost forgot how tense my body had felt all day, until my hand brushed his as we both reached for the same card. It was the lightest touch. A second at most. But it was enough. I pulled back instinctively, but he didn't react. He simply continued the game, as though nothing had happened. And maybe that was what made it feel even more significant, that he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't speak. He just looked up briefly, and in that moment, I felt everything. Later that night, my husband retired early, claiming exhaustion. I stayed behind to clean up the kitchen. He offered to help, and for a second, I hesitated. Then I nodded. We worked side by side in silence, washing and drying dishes, putting away leftover food. Our hands moved efficiently, calmly, but the air was anything but calm. I handed him a plate. Our fingers touched. Just barely. He held it for a second too long before placing it on the shelf. When everything was put away, I turned to thank him, but the words got stuck. He looked at me. I looked back. And then, we kissed. No words. No explanation. Just a kiss. I stepped away quickly, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. He didn't follow. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the hallway. I stood alone in the kitchen, hands trembling, lips still burning. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had done. Not the action itself, that was brief, almost innocent. But the intention behind it. The slow build. The endless dance. The moments we both let slip by, thinking they were harmless. They weren't. And I knew we couldn't go back. The cabin was quiet that night, almost oppressively so. I moved through the space like a ghost, light on my feet, avoiding every creaky board I had come to memorize over the last few days. I didn't want to wake my husband. I didn't want to see his face. Not because I was afraid of suspicion, but because I was afraid of my own guilt reflecting in his eyes, guilt he hadn't earned, guilt he wasn't even aware existed. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than necessary, gripping the porcelain sink with both hands. My reflection looked unfamiliar. Older, maybe. Or simply different. Not because of time or age, but because of everything I had been carrying in silence. I didn't look away. I wanted to face it. Whatever it was. Down the hall, the bedroom door creaked. My husband stirred but didn't rise. I heard the familiar rhythm of his breathing settle back into sleep, and with it came the sharp contrast between the life I was supposed to be living and the one I was slipping into, slowly, quietly, dangerously. I returned to the living room and sat on the couch, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders even though I wasn't cold. I didn't expect him to come back. After what had happened in the kitchen, part of me thought he would avoid me altogether. That maybe the silence would return, thicker than ever. But part of me also knew better. He appeared in the doorway just as I had turned off the lamp. Only the soft glow of the fireplace lit the room now. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He simply crossed the room and sat in the chair across from me, mirroring my stillness. For a while, we just sat like that, two people in the dark, surrounded by the hum of wind outside and the faint crackle of fire. No accusations. No excuses. Just the weight of what had happened hanging in the space between us. I shouldn't have let it happen, I said finally, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure he'd heard. He looked at me, eyes steady. Neither should I. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no justification. Just acknowledgement. That made it worse and somehow better. I looked down at my hands, clenched in my lap. It's not who I am. I know. But it was now. At least, it was part of me. I couldn't undo what we had done. I couldn't pretend the moment hadn't passed between us like a live wire, short-circuiting every rule I'd lived by. And yet, I couldn't pretend it didn't make me feel more awake than I had in years. We both went quiet again, lost in separate thoughts that felt dangerously similar. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere far off, a tree groaned in protest. The world was moving, shifting, creaking under the weight of things changing. And so were we. Eventually, he stood. I should go to bed. I nodded, and he turned without another word. I didn't sleep. I lay beside my husband again, frozen in my own body, counting the seconds until morning. I thought about what we had done, yes, but more than that, I thought about why it had happened. I thought about every quiet moment that led to that kiss. Every glance, every pause, every inhale that wasn't quite neutral. It hadn't been sudden. It had been slow and quiet and inevitable. The next morning, I avoided looking at either of them. I went through the motions of breakfast with the grace of someone pretending to exist. My husband chatted about a new trail he wanted to explore. I nodded, forcing a smile. He was excited, oblivious. And that only deepened the ache in my chest. After breakfast, we drove to a small overlook deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser there, their branches closing overhead like a canopy. The trail was less traveled, quieter. My husband took the lead again, humming as he went. I followed, and behind me, he followed. The same order we always seemed to fall into now. I kept my eyes on the path, but I could feel him behind me. Not just his footsteps, but his presence. Like the memory of the kiss clung to my skin, refusing to fade. Halfway through the hike, my husband stopped to take pictures of moss-covered rocks and an oddly shaped tree trunk. He moved ahead to get a better angle, leaving the two of us momentarily alone again. I stopped walking. So did he. You regret it? I asked without turning. He didn't answer right away. I don't know. Do you? I should have said yes. That was the correct answer. The moral one. The safe one. But I didn't say anything. We continued walking after that, the silence heavier than before. At the overlook, we stood beside my husband as he pointed out the valley below, talking about erosion or altitude or something else I barely heard. I smiled. I nodded. I posed for a photo he insisted on taking, the three of us standing awkwardly together in front of beauty we couldn't appreciate. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I took a long shower, hoping the water would wash away some of the guilt. It didn't. It only made me feel more hollow, more aware of the space I had created between myself and the life I used to call mine. Dinner was quiet. We ate by candlelight again because the overhead lights continued to flicker. My husband was tired and went to bed early, promising to get an early start for the return trip in the morning. Once he was asleep, I returned to the living room. The fire had burned down to embers. I didn't expect him to be there. But he was. This time, neither of us said anything. We simply sat, him in the chair, me on the couch. The silence was less tense now. Not because anything had been resolved, but because the truth no longer needed language. He stood after a while and moved toward the hallway. But he paused at the edge of the room and turned slightly. We kissed. The words were quiet. Factual. And that was all there was to say. The return home felt quieter than the drive to the mountains. My husband played the same playlist, but the songs seemed muffled somehow, their lyrics sliding past me without meaning. I sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked just enough to let the wind in, hoping the cool air would clear my thoughts. In the back seat, he wore headphones and rested his head against the glass, his eyes closed. If he was asleep, I couldn't tell. I didn't dare look for too long. I watched the trees blur into a stream of green and gold. The mountains receded behind us, disappearing like a dream I wasn't sure I'd had. The cabin, the woods, the wind, all of it faded into a memory too fresh to process. My chest felt tight, as if I had left a version of myself behind on that porch, staring into the dark. Once we pulled into our driveway, the familiarity of home struck me like a weight. The cracks in the sidewalk, the rusted garden tools by the shed, the welcome mat curling at the edges, everything was as it had been. But I wasn't. I walked inside slowly, letting my fingers trail along the wall, grounding myself in the details I used to find comfort in. My husband immediately launched into routine, checking the mailbox, unpacking the car, throwing laundry into the machine. He thrived in movement. In tasks. In fixing things. I envied that about him. He could anchor himself in the practical. I floated in the abstract, lost in thoughts I couldn't confess. Later that evening, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup I didn't want. The radio played softly in the background. He sat at the table flipping through emails on his tablet. He wasn't talking much, which suited me fine. I didn't know how to form words that wouldn't sound rehearsed. When he entered the room, I felt it immediately. Not because of sound, but because of the shift in air. He offered to help with dinner, but I declined without looking at him. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled slightly as I ladled soup into bowls. We ate together, the three of us, like any other family would after a weekend away. My husband asked about everyone's plans for the week. I answered automatically, saying I might organize the closet or repaint the hallway, small lies disguised as intentions. He mentioned an upcoming meeting. He said something about needing to replace the tires. He didn't notice that I was barely touching my food. After dinner, he excused himself to take a call. I remained at the table, staring at my reflection in the window. He cleared the dishes, his movements unhurried, careful. When he set a glass on the counter beside me, I thanked him without making eye contact. "I'll be gone most of tomorrow," he said softly. I nodded. He hesitated before stepping back. "Just thought you should know." And then he left the room. I sat in that chair for a long time after both of them were gone. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, measuring time I didn't feel passing. I stared at the place where the candlelight flickered against the surface of the glass, the distorted reflection of a woman I wasn't sure I knew anymore. That night, I lay beside my husband in bed, wide awake. His breathing was deep and even. I turned my head slightly to look at him. His face in sleep looked peaceful, untroubled. I envied that too. The ability to close his eyes and believe everything was as it should be. The next day passed like fog. My husband left early, just as he said he would. He kissed my cheek goodbye, a casual, routine gesture, and then he was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. I moved through the house slowly, folding towels I didn't remember washing, refilling the pantry, wiping surfaces that were already clean. He stayed in his room most of the day. I could hear occasional movements, footsteps, the creak of the floor, the soft thud of a closing drawer. But we didn't cross paths. It felt intentional. By late afternoon, I sat on the back porch with a book open in my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. The sun filtered through the leaves above, casting dappled shadows across the wooden boards. I sipped cold tea and watched as the light shifted with the wind. When I heard the door open, I didn't turn. I waited. He approached slowly and stood beside me for a moment before sitting in the chair across from me. We said nothing for a while. "It's strange being back," he said finally. I nodded. Yes. Feels like we didn't actually leave anything behind, though. Just pressed pause. His words settled between us like dust. I looked at him then. Not fully. Just enough to acknowledge the truth in what he said. "I keep trying to pretend it didn't happen," I admitted. "But it's like pretending I imagined breathing." He didn't answer right away. "I know." A breeze passed through, carrying with it the smell of soil and lavender from the edge of the garden. The wind always felt heavier after the rain, even if it hadn't rained yet. Like the sky was warning us in advance. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. I blinked, once. "Okay. I need to. It's getting harder to be here." I nodded slowly. I didn't ask where he would go. I didn't ask when he would return. I didn't ask anything. I knew that if I opened that door, it wouldn't close. He looked at me again. This time, fully. And there was something in his gaze, not desperation, not even sadness, but clarity. We had done something irreversible. And we both knew it. When he stood, I did too. We didn't touch. We didn't step closer. We just stood there, facing each other, as the wind pressed against our clothes and the sun began to drop behind the trees. Later that night, the house was quiet once more. My husband had returned, full of updates from his day, none of which I absorbed. I listened, nodded, smiled when expected. I helped with dinner. I asked the right questions. I played the part. But inside, something had shifted again. Not just guilt. Not even longing. Something deeper. A realization that life, once rearranged, rarely returns to its original shape. My husband left before sunrise. He had a business trip that would keep him away overnight, one of those last-minute arrangements that always seem to come at the worst possible time. He kissed my temple as I stood half asleep in the hallway, muttered something about traffic, and grabbed his suitcase. I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the quiet street, the headlights slicing through the fading darkness. And then I was alone. The silence that filled the house wasn't unfamiliar, but it felt different now. He hadn't left for a weekend getaway or a dinner meeting. He had left me, not in intention, but in effect. The moment the door closed behind him, the boundaries I had so carefully drawn in my mind began to blur again. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately. I cleaned the kitchen even though it was spotless. I folded the laundry that had already been folded. I rearranged books on the shelf that no one else touched. These were the rituals of avoidance, and I performed them with a quiet desperation that frightened me. Mid-morning passed without incident. I made tea and sat by the window, staring at the garden. The rosemary had grown wild again. The lavender leaned toward the sun, as if yearning for something just out of reach. I understood that feeling too well. When I heard footsteps behind me, I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. The air shifted in that specific way it only did when he entered a room. He didn't speak. He stood quietly, perhaps unsure of what to say. Or perhaps he, too, had run out of ways to pretend. I finally stood and turned to face him. Our eyes met, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other, not with longing or apology, but with something heavier. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. That we had both crossed a threshold and could never fully step back. He opened his mouth as if to speak but didn't. Instead, he walked to the table and sat down. I followed. I poured us both tea and set the mugs down carefully, as if handling something fragile. The room was filled with light, but the weight between us made everything feel dim. I thought you'd already left, I said eventually, my voice thin. I leave this evening, he replied. I nodded and sipped my tea. For a while, we sat like that. No music. No conversation. Just the quiet hum of a house waiting to become something else. In the early afternoon, I suggested we eat something. I wasn't hungry, not really, but I needed a reason to move, to fill the space with action instead of thought. We made sandwiches in silence. Our hands moved easily, like we had done this hundreds of times before, and in a way, we had. Not together, but in parallel lives that had been inching toward each other without notice. We sat at the kitchen counter to eat. The radio played softly, static between stations. I reached over and turned it off. I should pack, he said after a while. I nodded. Do you need anything? No. He rose slowly, his chair scraping gently against the floor. I didn't watch him leave the room. I stared at my plate instead, where crumbs had collected like tiny remains of something already broken. Upstairs, I could hear drawers opening and closing. The sound of a zipper. Footsteps. A pause. And then more footsteps. I imagined him folding his clothes with precision, just as he had always seen to fold his emotions, and neat, contained, invisible from the outside. I went to the living room, sat on the couch, and picked up a magazine I had no intention of reading. I flipped through the pages without seeing anything. My fingers trembled slightly, and I tucked them under the throw pillow beside me. When he came back downstairs, the sun had shifted. Light stretched across the floor in golden stripes, warming the wood in a way that made everything feel softer, almost forgiving. He sat in the chair across from me, his small duffel bag resting beside him on the floor. I could see how tightly it was packed, compact, efficient. There was no room left for anything unplanned. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly. "Neither do I." There was no resolution in that exchange. No answers. Just the acknowledgement of uncertainty. And that was more honest than anything else we had said all day. The hours between then and his departure moved in slow motion. We stayed in the living room, neither of us willing to be the first to walk away. The television remained off. The phone rang once and went unanswered. Outside, the wind picked up and tossed leaves across the porch in chaotic spirals. As the sky began to fade into dusky blue, he stood and reached for his bag. "I should go," he said. I nodded. We walked to the door together. The same door he had entered so many times without notice. Now it felt like a boundary, one that, once crossed, could not be recrossed without consequence. At the threshold, he paused. Our eyes met again. No words passed between us. Not this time. And then, we spent the night together. That's all I can say. That's all there is. The next morning, I woke up alone. The sunlight spilled through the curtains, painting gold across the sheets. The other side of the bed was cold, untouched. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. I sat up slowly, my body heavy, my thoughts heavier. Downstairs, the house was still. My husband would return later that evening. There would be dinner. There would be conversation. There would be routine. But nothing would be the same. Because something had changed in me. Something irreversible. And though no one else would see it, I would carry it everywhere. The morning after he left felt oddly hollow, like waking up in a house emptied of its furniture. Nothing was missing physically, but everything had shifted out of place. I sat at the edge of the bed longer than I usually did, staring at the soft crease on the pillow beside mine, untouched and cold. There was no note, no sign of him at all. Just absence. Heavy and quiet. Downstairs, the house was still. Even the birds outside seemed slower, less urgent in their songs. I made coffee without thinking, moving through the kitchen by muscle memory. The sound of the kettle boiling and the clink of the spoon against the ceramic cup gave the illusion of normalcy, but nothing felt normal. I carried my cup to the living room and sank into the couch, pulling a blanket around my shoulders even though it wasn't cold. The window framed a sky veiled in gray, low, and unmoving, as if time itself had stopped to observe the fallout of my choices. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. My body couldn't choose which emotion to express first: shame, grief, confusion, relief. So instead, it chose nothing. Stillness. I kept expecting to hear the sound of footsteps upstairs. A door creaking. The muted echo of him humming in the hallway. But there was only silence. The clock on the wall ticked through the day. I didn't check the time. I didn't turn on the television or reach for my phone. I existed in that living room like a shadow waiting to reattach to something real. By afternoon, I forced myself to move. I gathered the laundry that had accumulated and began folding it methodically. T-shirts, towels, pillowcases, each one a tiny act of control. Each fold, a small resistance to the chaos inside me. I stacked the clothes carefully in their places and paused when I reached for a pair of socks he had left in the basket. They were still warm from the dryer. I held them a little too long before setting them down and closing the drawer. I made myself eat something around 5, though I could barely taste the food. A bowl of soup. A slice of bread. It sat heavily in my stomach, like a weight I hadn't asked for. My hands moved slowly as I washed the dishes. The sponge squeaked softly against the porcelain. I watched the water swirl down the drain, hypnotic in its aimlessness. When my husband's car finally pulled into the driveway just after sunset, I stood by the window with my hands tucked into the sleeves of my cardigan. I watched him step out of the car, stretch, and retrieve his bag from the trunk. He looked tired. Not burdened, just normally tired, the kind of fatigue that comes from driving too long and thinking too little. I envied him for that. I opened the door before he reached it. He smiled and leaned in to kiss my cheek. I let him. His lips were cool from the evening air. "Everything okay here?" he asked casually, stepping inside. "Fine," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He told me about his trip while unpacking, a delayed meeting, traffic, a colleague who talked too much. I nodded in the right places, offered brief replies. I even smiled once or twice. It was easier than I thought it would be. Pretending. After dinner, which he insisted on ordering so I wouldn't have to cook, he sat in the living room watching a news program while I cleaned up. I wiped the same section of counter 3 times. My reflection in the dark window above the sink looked pale and thinner, like a photo left in the sun too long. Was that really me? I joined him on the couch eventually, sitting a little further away than usual. He didn't seem to notice. He commented on a news story, something about a politician's scandal, and shook his head with mock disapproval. I murmured in agreement. That night, I lay beside him in bed again. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady and deep. I stared at the ceiling, counting the faint shadows cast by the branches outside our window. I felt like a guest in my own life, one whose stay had already lasted too long. The next morning, the house returned to routine. He left early for work, pressing a kiss to my temple before walking out the door. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time afterward, watching the sun rise through the thin veil of clouds. I drank my coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth as if it could ground me. Later that day, I stepped into the guest room. It felt untouched, almost sterile. The bed was neatly made. The air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and dust. I walked around slowly, letting my fingers brush along the edge of the dresser, the windowsill, the doorknob. I opened the closet out of habit, though I knew it would be empty. Except it wasn't. On the floor, tucked in the corner, was a small folded piece of paper. I froze. My heartbeat quickened, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at it for a long moment before crouching down and picking it up. It wasn't addressed. There was no name. Just a few words written in neat, careful handwriting. "I won't forget. Please don't either." No signature. No explanation. I stood there for what felt like an hour, holding the paper in both hands. My fingers trembled. My knees ached from crouching, but I didn't move. The weight of those words, so simple, so final, settled deep into my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window, the paper still in my hand. What was I supposed to do now? He was gone. He had chosen to leave, perhaps to protect us both, Perhaps because staying would have destroyed something even larger. I didn't know. I might never know. But those words remained. A tether. A promise. A wound. And I knew then that pretending would never be enough. Not anymore. Because even if the house looked the same, even if my husband returned home every day with stories about the office and weekend plans, even if the dishes got washed and the floors got swept, something had changed. Something had been rearranged in the quiet, in the in-between. And no matter how carefully I tried to live around it, it would always be there. Waiting. The paper stayed on my nightstand for days. I didn't tuck it away in a drawer. I didn't throw it out. I couldn't. It remained folded in half, placed neatly beside the lamp, like an object of reverence and shame at once. I tried not to look at it when I passed, but I always did. Sometimes I'd pause, run a finger along the crease, but I never unfolded it again. I didn't need to. The words were already carved somewhere deeper than memory. Life resumed around it. My husband fell back into his routines easily, effortlessly. He asked how I was feeling, kissed my cheek before heading to work, brought home flowers on Thursday just because he saw them and thought I'd like them. And I did. I placed them in a vase by the kitchen window and watched them every morning as I drank my coffee. They bloomed quickly. And just as quickly, they began to wilt. I tried to engage with my days as if nothing inside me had been rearranged. I attended a community meeting I'd been putting off for weeks. I cleaned out the pantry. I answered texts from friends. I scheduled a dentist appointment. These were all things I did to maintain the shape of my life, a shape I could still wear, but no longer fill. The guest room stayed closed. I walked past it many times and always felt the same quiet ache. Sometimes I paused in front of the door, tempted to step inside, but I never did. That room, once just a room, had become a container for something I wasn't ready to face again. One morning, while folding laundry, I came across a shirt he had left behind. It had been washed and neatly folded with the rest of the clothes, but I recognized it immediately, the soft navy cotton, the faint stitching at the hem. I stared at it in my hands for a long time before tucking it into the bottom drawer of my dresser, beneath sweaters I rarely wore. I wasn't saving it. I wasn't holding on. I just couldn't let it go. Not yet. The days moved slowly but steadily. Conversations with my husband became more surface level, which suited us both. We exchanged updates, shared meals, and navigated the small logistics of life like co-captains of a ship that neither of us realized had changed course. One Saturday afternoon, while he was outside mowing the lawn, I decided to go for a walk. The weather had softened, late spring sunlight filtering through a sky that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be blue or gray. I walked without direction, letting the rhythm of my footsteps guide me. I passed familiar houses, blooming gardens, children chalking drawings on the sidewalk. Everything looked as it always had, but I saw it differently now, not because anything had changed, but because I had. Eventually, I found myself at a small park near the edge of town. It wasn't one I visited often. I sat on a bench near the pond and watched the water ripple under the breeze. Ducks glided slowly across the surface, utterly unbothered by the rest of the world. I envied their simplicity. Across the park, a young couple sat beneath a tree, laughing at something on a phone screen. The woman leaned into the man's shoulder, and he kissed her forehead absent-mindedly, like a habit formed from years of closeness. I looked away before the ache in my chest could rise to my throat. I stayed there for over an hour, just breathing, listening, watching. Letting the noise of the world settle around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. When I returned home, my husband was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. He glanced up, smiled, and asked if I had a good walk. I said yes. He nodded and returned to chopping. That night, as I lay in bed, I reached for the paper again. Still folded. Still quietly waiting. I opened it this time. Slowly. The ink had faded just slightly along the crease, but the words remained the same. I won't forget. Please don't either. I read them over and over, trying to understand what they were asking of me. Was it remembrance? Forgiveness? A reminder? I didn't know. But I did know this: I couldn't forget. I hadn't. Not for a moment. And still, I didn't know what to do with that truth. The following day, while cleaning the attic, another project I had postponed for years, I stumbled across an old photo album. It was filled with pictures from the early years of my marriage, vacations, holidays, birthdays. I sat on the dusty floor and flipped through the pages, stopping on one that made my breath catch. It was a photo of me and my husband at the beach. We were laughing, wind-blown and sunburnt, holding hands like we didn't know what distance was. I stared at that image for a long time, searching for the version of myself who had lived that moment. She looked so young. So sure. So unaware of the cracks that would someday form beneath the surface. I closed the album gently and placed it back in the box. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. In the dream, everything was the same: the smell of pine, the flicker of candlelight, the low hum of wind outside. I stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching snow fall softly around me. He stood beside me, but neither of us spoke. We just looked out at the trees, silent witnesses to a silence of our own making. When I woke, the ache in my chest was dull but persistent. Like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. I didn't tell my husband about the dream. I didn't tell anyone. It was mine alone. In the days that followed, I moved a little more freely. I returned the paper to the drawer and let myself walk past the guest room without pausing. I joined a local book club. I spent more time in the garden. I let the air touch my skin without flinching. It wasn't healing. Not exactly. But it was motion. And for now, that was enough. The days grew warmer. Spring leaned fully into summer, and with it came a subtle shift in everything. The windows stayed open longer. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. Even the rhythm of the neighborhood changed: more laughter drifting from porches, more footsteps on evening walks, more movement everywhere. Inside me, something was still. I thought often of that folded paper, though I hadn't touched it again. I knew exactly where it was, tucked beneath the sweaters I never wore, a quiet reminder of a version of myself that still hadn't figured out what to do with the weight she carried. I didn't forget. I couldn't. But I no longer read the words each day to prove it. The truth had rooted itself deeper than paper. My husband remained consistent. He was kind, attentive in his way, but unaware. Or maybe not unaware, just unwilling to ask questions he wasn't prepared to hear the answers to. We moved like two people orbiting the same space, careful not to collide. There were no arguments, no accusations. Just distance, politely preserved. We began planning a trip, just the two of us. Something small, simple. A weekend by the coast, he suggested. A hotel with a view. Long walks on the beach. I said yes, not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't have the energy to say no. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find there. Maybe distraction. Maybe a bridge back to something we'd lost. Or maybe I just didn't want to sit still anymore. In preparation for the trip, I sorted through drawers and closets, making small decisions about what to pack and what to leave behind. I found old swimsuits that no longer fit, scarves I hadn't worn in years, a pair of sandals still new in their box. The act of choosing what to carry felt heavier than it should have. That afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the hallway, I knocked over a small ceramic bowl and cracked it along the side. It wasn't valuable, just a handmade piece I'd picked up at a local market years ago, but the sound of it breaking echoed louder than it should have. I stood there for a long time, staring at the crack, unsure whether to throw it away or glue it back together. Eventually, I placed it on the windowsill in the laundry room, the fracture turned away from view. The day before we were supposed to leave, my husband came home with brochures for the hotel, menus from restaurants he thought I'd like, and a beach hat he said looked like me. I smiled and thanked him. I placed the brochures on the counter and hung the hat by the door. Then I excused myself to take a walk. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. I walked slowly through the neighborhood, each step measured, as if my feet needed to be convinced to keep going. I passed familiar houses, smiled at neighbors, waved at children drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. The world kept turning. Somewhere near the edge of the neighborhood, I stopped in front of a small bakery. The smell of warm bread drifted out through the open door. I stepped inside, if only to delay returning home. I browsed the shelves without much intention, finally choosing a loaf I didn't need and a jar of homemade jam I probably wouldn't open. The woman at the counter rang me up with a soft smile and asked if I needed a bag. I said no. As I stepped back outside, I realized I had no desire to eat what I'd just bought. I sat on a bench a block away, the paper bag resting on my lap. I looked up at the sky, now streaked with gold and lavender, and felt the familiar weight settle back into my chest. I didn't want to go on that trip. Not because of the hotel or the beach or the awkward silence I knew would fill the space between us. But because I couldn't pretend anymore. I had reached the end of the pretending. That night, I lay in bed beside him again. He was already asleep, the steady rhythm of his breath filling the room. I stared at the ceiling, fingers curled into the sheet, trying to find the courage I'd been avoiding. In the morning, I woke early. I moved quietly through the house, packing a small bag, not for the trip, but for myself. I included only what I needed. A few clothes. My journal. My toothbrush. The jar of jam I hadn't opened. Before I left, I wrote a note. Not an explanation. Just a truth. I need time. I need space. This isn't your fault. It's something I have to understand for myself. I don't know what I'll find, but I can't look for it here. Please don't follow me. Please take care of yourself. I'm sorry I couldn't be the person you needed. I folded the note and placed it on the kitchen table. Then I picked up my bag and walked out the door. The morning air was cool. The sky was clear. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to clarity. Not peace, exactly. But the possibility of it. I didn't know where I was going. But I knew I couldn't stay.